So in this video I'm going to be talking a bit about Plato, his view on life after death and the soul. Now to start with, I think it's important that we understand the analogy of the cave. Now essentially I have already a written post on my AS site, and what he's trying to show is that our bodies are like prisons where the soul is stuck. And what we think is reality, we see these shadows. It's not, because the reality is people walking past us in the real world, the world of the forms, and the fire making a reflection. We don't actually see the real picture. And when we philosophize and we realize what the reality is, that's when we start to become free. And he talks about this guy coming back, which we'll look at in a minute, the myth of who actually is talking about Socrates here, coming back and telling people what reality is. This is philosophers like Plato trying to tell us what reality is. Now I'm going to assume you've seen a picture of the cave and you understand that the sun is a form of the good and what the different elements are and what they represent. I'm going to assume that you know that, and I'm going to try and connect all of my points up with the cave, because I think that's a good way of summarizing his work. Now he's a dualist. So this means he believes in the body and the soul and them being two different parts. He says that the soul is more important than the body. This is because the soul is something that exists before the body and after the body. It's eternal. Its house is in the world of the forms, whereas the body, once it's dead, it's dead. So it's not as important. It just lives in our natural world, the physical world. It's not living beyond that. That's why the soul for Plato is 100 times more important than the body. And he says that also the body is actually a real distraction, because not only does it distract us from our real purpose in life, which is to philosophize and let our soul discover the truth and be liberated in the world of the forms, it distracts us. He writes this quote. He says that the body fills us full of love, lusts and fears and fancies of all kinds. And these are not things that we should really be focusing on. We're trying to get away from there, trying to get more into philosophizing. Okay, so now let's go on. We've discovered that he believes in the soul. Soul is more important than the body and is different, and the body is a distraction from our real purpose. So now how does the soul work? Well, what Plato does is he gives an analogy of the soul being like a charioteer who has two horses, and he says the charioteer is reason. It controls the two horses. It's constantly trying to balance out what our two horses are trying to do. And one horse is appetite, so it's our bodily needs, as it says there, love, lust, fears, fancies of all kinds. We want to eat, things like that. And then you have the spirit, which is the other one, and that one is more like it knows our true purpose. It wants us to achieve it. It wants us to philosophize, but we are not able to do this because sometimes our horse of appetite is pulling us in the other direction. So the reason is constantly trying to control the two horses, and this is how the soul works. And we can see that this appetite, this horse, eventually after death we get to let go of it. So this means that our spirit, our soul, can go to the world of the forms. And in the analogy of a cave, he talks about the prisoners being chained in a place like this, and he says that the soul is in there and it wants to escape, to go out of the cave, but it can't because our body has trapped it. He says the soul is simple, it's indivisible. It's a really simple thing. Not like the body, it can come alive and die and all these things. It's just simple, it's indivisible, and it's one thing, And he provides evidence for why the soul exists. He says, you don't believe that the soul exists, I'll prove it. He says, when we learn, we don't actually learn. So when in school, or now I'm telling you about Plato, you're not actually learning anything new. You're just remembering it because you know all of this information from the world of the forms. And he says, what carries that? Your soul, because your soul lives before your body and after your body. And so how does he prove that we remember things and that the soul exists? He says, Socrates called in a slave boy once and gave him a mathematical problem to solve. And the slave boy, who was illiterate, had no previous education. he was actually able to solve this thing using a technique which was reminiscent of Pythagoras' theorem, which showed that he might not be consciously aware of what he has done, but subconsciously he is. And therefore, this proves that the soul exists, because otherwise, how would that slave boy have this knowledge to be able to solve the maths problem? Another example is if I tell you to close your eyes and imagine a perfect circle, you can. If I tell you to draw it, even with the compass, you won't be able to get it exact, so smooth. Even on the computer, it's pixelated. You will never ever get a perfect circle, yet you can see it in your mind. You can imagine it. The reason being, in the world of the forms, you've seen the perfect circle, but you can't. But you haven't seen it in the real world, because the real world, the circles are just a shadow, an illusion of the real one. And this is his proof for his theory. And where does all of this begin? So we talked about being dualist and the soul being different to the body. Why is the soul more important? Because it knows about the purpose and how does it work. Charioteer example. What's the proof for it? Well, we have the slave boy in the perfect circle. But where does all this begin? Well, this all begins in something called the cycle of opposites. So, for example, if I know that light exists, then it is necessary that dark exists, because you can have no light and therefore there's dark. So the same way, if we know that death exists, then we know that rebirth exists. This cycle of opposites, and it keeps going on, and that's what he talks about. And then he goes on now in the analogy of a cave. Now I'm going to bring you back to where I started. There's a soldier who comes back to tell all of the prisoners the reality that there's actually a world out there, and none of them believe him, or they want to punch him. And this is stemming from his myth of and it actually. The soldier who comes back actually relates to Socrates, although it's not spelled out. So what he does is he makes a fictional character to show the role of philosophers and why they're so important. And he says it's called He's a soldier. He dies on a battlefield. And what happens is 12 days later, he comes back. And he comes back to life, like a resurrection, for example. He comes back to life to tell everyone, look, this is what's happened to me. You are all being reincarnated. There's a world of the forms, a form of the good. You need to see reality. But no one believes him. So what Plato is trying to say is that actually people are being stupid. They should be believing. And if they don't want to believe, then they should be philosophizing, because they will come to the same conclusion. Now, there's certain problems with Plato as well. So, for example, if a soul is constantly being reincarnated, then it doesn't explain what makes me so individual. And it's a weird one, because it's difficult to answer that. Obviously, Plato would say what makes you individual is the way that your reason is kind of controlling the two horses, because whichever body you're in, it'll be different, because each body will have a different appetite and desire, so you get pulled sometimes more. And appetite and desire is not just one thing being pulled. You might be pulled more in the lust direction, or more in the greed direction, or more in the jealousy. It depends. And then he says there's no evidence for the world of the forms. Well, Plato is providing evidence for the world of the forms, because he gives example of the slave boy. So whatever it is, you might say that there's no evidence, but Plato would argue he is giving evidence. But the way you would want to phrase it to actually show why Plato's theory does not work is that you would say he starts by saying that the world of the form exists, and then says, so he presupposes it exists, and then says, oh, because he remembers it, that means that it exists. When you've already said that already exists. So circular reasoning again. Then he talks about that one of the good things about theory, it ties nicely in with not just Christianity but Buddhism, Hinduism, Sikhism, all the religions, because basically Western philosophy, and actually I would say Eastern philosophy too, are all just footnotes of Plato's work. That's what they are. And then the circle of opposites, strange one, because to say that death necessitates rebirth is not really true, because hunger does not give birth to satisfaction. But with this criticism, I think they're missing something. I think what they mean is that when you're hungry, but you understand that there will be satisfaction, because you might be zero hungry, no hungry, then that means you're fully satisfied. So the same way that if there is a death, then there must be rebirth. Thank you for watching. Please visit my blog.